Hello and welcome back to the PSC in Conversation. This is part of our Next 20 series, and we are absolutely thrilled to have one of our most esteemed alumni joining us for today's episode. We have Dr. Paul Bate, and we'll be talking about public services, space, an amazing career with much more excitement to come across public services, and it's a real pleasure to have you. Thanks for joining.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So Paul, I mean, we will go broad and deep on space, satellites, public sector, healthcare more, but you have an amazing vantage point. So started your, early career in academia, PhD in particle physics, then McKinsey, then the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit, where you were senior problem solver.
That's right.
Such a good title. Then number 10, senior advisor to the Prime Minister on health.
Yes, with a bit of a gap in the middle though for.
Well, we'll come back to that. Care Quality Commission, Level on Health, and most recently the UK Space Agency, and a time in between, which is when we of course first met each other, which was then 2020 delivery. I'm confident you were the first person to ever give me feedback, so thank you very much for that important life passage, so we're reflecting on 20 years of the PSC, and we're delighted that you could join us. So whilst we are, I suppose, in that first area of looking back, and particularly on the space and satellite sector and why it matters, let's just start. I mean, how much has the sector changed over the last 20 years or so? I mean, the agency started in 2010, so 20 years ago there was no space agency, but a huge amount has changed. How do you think about that? What have been the most significant changes?
Yeah, so I think the starting point is that the physical environment we're talking about. So let's go back even further than 20 years. Pre-1957, pre-Sputnik, there's one satellite going around the Earth, and it's the moon. That's it. Right. And every human pretty much has looked up and has seen that one celestial body. And then Sputnik and for a large period of time, a bit of a race between the US and the Soviets, other countries getting involved a bit as well. The UK, one of the first countries to put a satellite into space, with Ariel 1, I think it was called. But the point is, it's very, very small numbers, right? And really not that sophisticated. Sputnik, I think it'd be fair to say, changed the world, changed the way in which the US thought about its dominance. Arguably was one of the biggest drivers for the human spaceflight program, because that dominance in space had been established by the Soviets. But it beeped, right? It wasn't the most complicated piece of technology. Incredibly difficult to get it up there, and all the rest of it required an amazing rocket. But it wasn't that it was phenomenally flashy in its technology, and really for many decades. So, even until, to use your point about sort of last 20 years, maybe 100 satellites would be launched each year, give or take. And then something just extraordinary happens, give or take about 5-10 years ago, which is the ability to put satellites into space changes dramatically, and SpaceX clearly are the leaders there. They develop a rocket, they develop the Falcon rocket series that is reusable. That's the fundamental thing that brings the cost down. The first stage, the big bit at the bottom, up it goes, and instead of just being dumped in the Pacific or wherever it might be, never to be seen again, it is returned to Earth in a controlled way, sometimes on a boat, sometimes landing back in Florida. And that totally changed the economics of getting things into orbit, something like 10 times cheaper than it had previously been. And alongside that, people are finding cheaper ways to build the satellites as well. And that is an unsung story for the UK. So Surrey University in Martin Sweeting, Professor Sir Martin Sweeting, works out that you don't always need to get the most expensive component that has been tested to within its intimate life and flown before, to make a fully working satellite. So he uses more commercial, off-the-shelf components, and he builds satellites, slightly smaller ones, maybe 100 kilos, 150 kilos, and they work, and it's revolutionary. It's really people tell stories of how that heavily influenced the way in which Elon Musk thinks about developing cost-effective satellites themselves, a Starlink system. So these things start to happen, and the result is it's not a great idea to use the word explosion in space, but explosion in the sense of the numbers of used satellites. So we suddenly have thousands of satellites being launched per year. SpaceX now launch, if not every day, every couple of days. And I was in Florida, I think, last year, and I slept through 2 launches. And it wasn't deliberate. Actually, I wasn't waiting for the launch I was supposed to be going to, but literally 2 happened in the night. I wasn't even aware of them. And that's nuts. That's like Heathrow, not episodic. And we now have 9,000 Starlink satellites. We have something like 13,000 or so usable satellites. Satellites are actually working, maybe a bit more, but the interesting fact that most of the satellites in orbit that are working are owned by one company, owned by SpaceX. And with predictions, we'll have 60,000 in orbit by the end of this decade. Right, that is hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands annually. That's the change that we're seeing. And what I find, fascinating, not just to kind of playing back to the physics days 30 years ago, but the basic maths of that, whether it's fully exponential or just a very close approximation at the moment, means that we've gone through that relatively long period, or it felt like a long period of 100 or so. That literal takeoff is going to fundamentally change the dynamics of what we do from space, how we do it, all the challenges of sustainability, orbital environment. So to me, this is the best decade to be involved in space. I didn't quite live through the Apollo era. I imagine that was pretty cool too. But for any of us who are didn't witness the first time humans were on the moon, certainly I think this is the decade to be involved.
And that timeline is fascinating and brilliant, and it brings me parochially back to the domain that I suppose I spend most time around in AI. And one of the big points there is that not a dissimilar timeline, the Dartmouth conference, I think 56, and actually the transformer architectures which underpin these new generative AI models also 5 to 10 years old. And one of the big points there is that this is a very, very recent new technology, and nobody knows where or to whom the economic benefits are going to accrue. Would that be fair to say the same for satellite technology, that actually this is an amazing time, but we don't yet know even its full potential?
Definitely true. Definitely don't know its full potential. And I just say with a bit of humility, right? I mean, if it's, who knew that GPS would be transformational? A technology that is there fundamentally to support warfighters to know where they are. Right, that's unambiguously why GPS was developed in the first place. And then you have a decision on policy decision in the US. Let's just make that signal free. I really don't believe they understood or could possibly have known the economic value and the societal value that would suddenly everybody would know where they were and could get from A to B an entire, but not just Deliveroo or Just Eat. But you think how much is now underpinned by knowing where you are and can and the timing for the financial services. It's just absolutely fascinating. We're seeing Earth observation, this idea of having sensors on satellites, like telescopes pointing back down, images, really take off. But I'm sorry, explosions taking off. It's an occupational hazard that these languages. But no one's really commercialized that yet. There are people like Planet Labs and Maxar are making good money, but why we would necessarily believe that that's going to be the only business model? So right in the foothills.
And on GPS, it just because I think it's such a brilliant case study of nobody knows quite where the amazing benefit will come from. Is there a lesson there? So you spoke at the Foundation of Science Tech science and technology recently about specificity and capabilities, and I guess with GPS, I'm wondering if there's a lesson there that policymakers and governments can never really know what the right thing is that's going to deliver the most benefit to people. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, I think it is. So the point that I was mulling on and sort of trying to get over is that right now this government has prioritised national security and economic growth, and those are very legitimate outcomes. And in space, there's now a very strong sort of policy steer towards developing specific capabilities in pursuit of those two things. The argument I was making was there's nothing wrong with that. There's certainly nothing, particularly on the security side. Perhaps something it can be, I think, very clear to those in the know, our security colleagues, our defence colleagues, what highly assured capabilities they need and what allies have and adversaries have or are building. And that's a very good reason to focus on those capabilities. But when it comes to economic growth, it would be, I think, a shortcut and probably logically not a great one to assume that the underlying capabilities that are necessary for national security will necessarily be the ones that drive economic growth. It's a Venn diagram, I'm sure there's overlap.
Yeah.
But because it's so important to stimulate the economy, I don't think it will be sufficient to just to focus on capabilities. I think focusing on markets and focusing on the characteristics of great scale-ups in the UK is a winning strategy. So I really like the way in which there's much more talk about scale-up organisations and business in the house. But having sort of lived through a scale-up journey,
Well, yes,
a scale-up is not a big startup. Right, I mean, that's a necessary condition. You have to go from somewhere. But the idea that all you do is you take any startup and give it more money and more people, and it's going to scale up. It's a hard yard. And for a government to be able to figure out, we'll choose this company and that company, that's difficult. But I do think it's important to run a portfolio. You need to know which set of companies are most likely to be successful, certainly in which markets, which comes back to the capability point. Capabilities are good, but specificity of understanding markets. So where are we heading on 5G, 6G communications? What really is a direct-to-device market going to be like when we're talking about comms? We shouldn't expect to have a moratorium or a monopoly on knowledge. That's a really good thing for a government to invest in. I also think it brings in talent, brings in excited and expert people who want to kind of cut the wheat from the chaff. And what a great way to describe it. It's not say, I want you to pick a company or I want you to just pick a general capability area. But why don't we get together and we'll figure out which markets have the greater chance of success? Exactly, of course, what the private investors are also trying to do, and then run a portfolio against that. So there, I think that there's some seeds that I think are now in government thinking, not least in Way Innovate UK. Are clearly thinking about this that are really good, because they focus on that approach.
Good, yes. Let's come back to that because you highlight some exciting and I think maybe underappreciated focus areas on quantum, deep tech, 6G and more, which there is a lot of attention and investment and potential that's there, and as we look ahead to the next 20 years, maybe they can be capitalized on. But let's reflect for a little bit on the 31st of March was your last day as CEO of the UK Space Agency. Fantastic few years, huge improvements and huge achievements across the sector. I think I heard you speak very proudly of the organisation as well itself. Staff engagement going up. But what do you reflect on as being your most proud, I guess, achievements and legacy from the Space Agency?
Well, look, the first thing, space takes time. So most of the things that came to fruition while I was there were absolutely because other people had set them in motion, got them going, and of course, a team and teams of teams deliver them. And it can be an absolute privilege when you're running the organisation to take all the credit. I try not to do that too often. But some things I think you can look at a tenure and what you do as a group appeal over a period of time and think, yeah, I think we can be justifiably proud of that. So the two things that I always thought were the most important, one was that we didn't historically know very much about the impact. Right? We had a good theory of change that if we invest in deep research and innovation, largely through grants, it will bear fruit in time. We had some sort of goodish evaluation that it had worked. We knew that working with the European Space Agency had value. It gave us access to assets and missions that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do. Some of that was qualitative, and where it was quantitative, quite often it was based on sort of wider models of things that had happened in the R&D sectors generally. Right. It wasn't specific to what the space agency had invested in. And then absolute credit to the analysts who developed this. We looked at all the investments that had been made, and we looked at the companies that we had made those investments in, and we looked at their how much they invested in R&D and how much revenue they generated and how much wider capital they brought in. Those sorts of metrics. We looked both before and after the moment of investment, all right, and we compared companies that received money and hadn't. We used publicly available information, and we did the double difference in difference analysis, right? Which, if you really want to do the gold-plated analysis, do a randomized controlled trial. Right, that's quite tricky. If you're handing out money of taxpayers' money, you can't really double blind that. No. It's going to be a bit awkward when we have a conversation with the Public Accounts Committee. Brilliant evaluatively, not spectacular from trust and from taxpayers. But after that, a difference in difference analysis is the way forward. It is the next best. And what we found was that the UK Space Agency, as a result of its investments, had catalysed investment to the tune of £2.2 billion annually. Wow. Right? Now, I've got this right. Now, I need to be very careful about my language here. So we were that in 2024, 2025 year, in that 1 year alone, we were the result of the investments that we'd made to date had an additional impact of 2.2 billion. That I think is the technically correct way of doing it. And when you think that the agency had been spending 500 million annually, it's rising, you can see that is a really good multiple. Now, there's more to it because of time series and the rest of it. But just to know that there was that sort of order of value being brought, I thought it was great. And I think something can be done. Obviously, it's not specific to space. It was really important that we invested in the understanding, and I think it gave people confidence in what we were doing. So that was one good thing. Really pleased. And I could talk about the major missions, the fact that we've got the JUICE spacecraft on its way to Jupiter, Euclid's launch, Bepi Colombo will go into orbit around Mercury this year. There is no shortage of amazing things. But the other one that I was used to 2.2 billion, and at least as importantly, possibly more, was the numbers on the staff survey. And just to digress for a second, but to tell us something that has nothing to do with space. When I was at the Care Quality Commission, we were determined to get past really kind of superficial ticks and crosses for whether a hospital or a care home or a GP or a dentist was doing well or not. And so we had to work out what mattered. And you have to cross the threshold. You have to go and inspect to really know what's going on is one thing. Yeah. But when it comes to the data and it comes to hospitals, if you could only pick one piece of data, which you shouldn't, but if you could only pick one, the one you'd pick every time is the staff engagement survey. It's not what patients say, which really matters what patients say. Yeah. But patients are at a moment of deep trouble and fear and are likely to give a very positive response. Right. And so it's quite hard to differentiate. Whereas what the staff say, they typically know what's going on. Doesn't mean every member of staff knows exactly what's going on in every part of the hospital, but it's a terrific measure, and so staff engagement really matters. And so we looked really carefully at that in the agency. And the two things that I'm most proud of, when we moved, I think it was in 3 years, we moved the leadership and managing change score up 16 percentage points. Wow. So I think people had some faith that we were heading in the right direction and that our leaders were doing the right things. And the bullying and harassment, which was at one point, I think in 2020, 2021, we had the highest levels of bullying and harassment in the civil service. I mean, it's not something that anyone really wants to talk about, understandably, but that's factually where it was. It's over 100 civil service organisations, including armed service bodies, and that's unfortunately the situation. I think it was 21% of people were reporting that they had experienced bullying or harassment, and it was not a dissimilar number they had experienced discrimination, right? And we halved the bullying and harassment reported amounts, and we halved the discrimination. And it's so important because it's the lifeblood of an organisation that you can come to work and feel safe, and that you can do your best on the day you present, and which, for what it's worth, nobody is at their best every day.
No.
I mean,
no.
wouldn't that be lovely and weird?
Yeah.
But you've got your own context and things going on in your life, but you feel safe to do the job that you can do on the day, and to aspire to do the best thing for yourself and for the team and for the organisation. And you're not going to feel that way if you're looking over your shoulder.
No.
So 2.2 billion, halving bullying and harassment, I feel that as an entire agency, the 350 of us, that is something that we took on together and can feel justifiably proud of.
That's tremendous. Thank you, Paul. And I mean, elsewhere in this series, we've talked with Ellie Bond about psychological safety. I'm just wondering what, on the second one of the halving of those bullying and harassment levels, what's the role? What's the role of the CEO in that? What's the role of leadership and the leader there? Because that must be an amazing but challenging journey to go through.
Roy Lilly, one of those NHS commentators.
NHS commentator, yeah.
He had a lot. It always stuck with me. He said that leaders don't set culture, but they do set climate, because culture is what everybody. It is a sum total of hundreds of thousands of interactions. Yeah. And you can't do that as a leader. You are a tiny proportion of those. But you can set the climate, the weather, if you like, on that. And I think that is the job that we took on as a leadership team. And of course, leadership teams change over time. So there was one team, a singular group of people that were there for the full time I was there. There are great leaders in the agency who were there before I was there, and there was obviously are still there. But for the period where we were collectively together, we talked a lot and very openly about psychological safety. And I don't think it had been talked about. Maybe it was just a different language as you used, but one of the nice things about leaving a job is that people tell you what they liked and what they really didn't like. And one thing I was catching up with one of them was the leadership team, and they were saying to me that we had conversations about psychological safety, and we hadn't previously done that, because she was on the team long before I was. And I thought it was really interesting. And we didn't talk about it in isolation, because I think you can jump on a bandwagon.
Yes.
I think they're interesting things. But if you take leadership as a right, we're going to focus on that thing, it's probably not going to work. But what we tried to do as a team and across the agency as a result was we tried to create a model of what we thought would be a better path. And we didn't make it up from scratch. We used Patrick Lencioni, right? This I love him. I mean, over 5 dysfunctions of a team, and he fundamentally, his conception is that you start bad teams up by not having trust. Yeah. And you can't have trust without safety. But we built everything on the model that it was of what it would take to be psychologically safe, which includes, you have to build empathy and a sense of an appropriate professional intimacy to say what you feel vulnerable about. We had an exercise where we each wrote down for each other in the leadership team something that we thought the other person did that was great, and something that just wound us up. and we didn't broadcast that to the organisation. It was kept within a safe space. But oh my word, that made a difference. Partly because it was really interesting to know, because you can open the window of how people perceive you. And I hope the feedback I gave you at the beginning was
spot on.
Okay.
Spot on.
But it was also to prove trust in each other.
That's such a great point.
So it was psychological safety, but it was psychological safety for a purpose. And I think when people across the organisation saw that we were serious about that, it wasn't a flash in the pan first thing the boss says, and then then all he cares about is technology.
Yeah.
It gave people permission to act as professional human beings who wanted to do their best, and everyone had joined a space agency. I mean, I still get the goosebumps at the idea that I was involved in the space agency. That's pretty normal, right? And it's a lot of this was just permission to dream that it could be as good as you thought it might be.
Well, let's talk about as good as it can be, and the UK's role in particular. So it's a very changing global landscape. The 4 missions have been clearly identified. But what are the UK's particular space strengths?
So this gets debated a lot, and sometimes there's a bit of kind of whatever it is that the person's interested in. And there are many. Let me just pick out a couple of things which I think are really interesting in what we do. So the first is we have phenomenal universities, right? That's not just a statement of interest. We have 4 of the top 10 universities in the world. Globally, I mean, not just the space, but that's the UK's reality today. Wow. And many more in the top 100. So for a country that has 1% of the global population, what an attractor is that? That's like a kind of a happy black hole that brings people in. So people want to come to the UK because they know that there is phenomenal research that is being done. So right at the cutting edge. And for something like space, which really is cutting edge stuff, literally pushing the frontier. That's a great win. And our universities are highly sought after in international collaborations. There's it's just a reality that when the Webb telescope was being conceived of and built over 20 years, that's a $10 billion experiment with over 300 individual points of failure, ones that have been released by the Ariane rocket that launched it. That's just astonishing in its own right. But the point of the story isn't just one engineering feat. It's that there are 4 main instruments on it, as it sits a million miles away, doing its spectacular thing. One of those 4 instruments is built in the UK, designed in the UK, and where the co-investigative lead, Gillian Wright, is in the UK. I mean, she's this is the University of Edinburgh and the Astronomy Technology Centre. It's just spectacular. It's just one example of how you can get an unbelievable multiplier effect. I think the total cost of the UK contribution was of the order 50 million. £50 million on a $10 billion experiment. Those are some good multipliers.
Yes.
Right? You'd be happy.
Yes.
If you were like
happy
VC, you'd be happy with that. But it's because our universities are great. They were sought out. Right. So we are really, really very good. So you've got that academic sector that's really world leading. There's a term that gets bandied around, but it's true in this case. Cosmically leading as far as we know, but
Nice.
And we have real strength in our startup community. We have 1,900 organizations in the space sector in the UK. Right, that is more, as far as we are, than any other European country by a significant distance. And while not all of them will make it, what a vibrant starting point that is. Right, so it was one of the pleasures of the job to be able to see different companies developing, and in this drive for economic growth, and economic growth comes from scaling up a business. Right. It is one of those real misconceptions that when we just say, the small and medium enterprises drive the economy. Well, it's the ones that grow that drive the economy. But they are more likely to grow. So having that real bedrock of small companies who are starting to make it, starting to find product market fit. What a great place to be now that we are actively, as the government, focusing on scale ups. And we sometimes, maybe it's just like a British quirk that it was seen as a problem. Well, we've got too many. Maybe what we've done is just spread the money too thinly. That's just the wrong way to think about it. The results of some really good policy in the last sort of 10, 15 years in space grew the space sector from, I think, around, maybe it wasn't even 100 companies. I mean, it's very small comparatively to the current situation. Now we have some challenges because we haven't got those sort of really big, like the decacorns sort of going to the scale-ups yet. But I'd much rather be building from having that sort of that nascent group of kind of commercial organizations. So I just think we've got that, and we've got our university sector. Wow.
Yeah. And so that 100 to 1900 is amazing, and you're absolutely right to point out those academic strengths. But I think it would be fair to say the sector can sometimes struggle to capture the space, much debate in the political sphere, because it doesn't quite have the retail appeal for citizens. And is that a material challenge? And from the outside, it can seem it a little bit in the political arena. And how can that be overcome?
So I think it's a real challenge because it's at the absolute extremes. So the positive is on this is we know when Tim Peake went to the space station in 2015, 2016, that was an incredible moment, right? We know it's not your face or my face at Heathrow, it's Tim's, right? We have this incredible national pride, which politicians and the public really got behind. Okay, that's the kind of the positive and the most visible human side of space. At the same time, if you're looking for something that could be perceived as hosing money on something that is either a vanity project or could easily go wrong, rockets blow up, satellites don't work. This is really early stage or innovation at its heart, right? And feels very remote. It's not numbers of nurses. It's not supporting and the welfare bill. There are really down to earth things. I get asked by friends, by family, by people I've been talking to, is it worth it? Right? Brian Cox always says, by the way, please rest assured, all the money we spend in space is actually spent on Earth. That's quite a good point.
Good point.
But but it really is an extreme. And why I don't think we talk about science fiction enough. Right. Yeah. So most people's conception of space is sci-fi. Yeah. Most people's reason to be in the space sector, the positive side of this, is because they saw something when they were younger. They might have been Trekkies. Yeah. They may have really whirled a lightsaber around.
Was it Doctor Who?
Doctor Who for me, although I got a passion for Blake Seven as well. But you ask most people, and they would say there is some sci-fi link. And it's not just true for the kind of 55,000 people who work in the space sector in the UK. It is a source of phenomenal inspiration and hope, but it's usually informed by films and books and TV. When NASA ask why should they be funded, which they do an annual survey, the number one reason is not to go to Mars, not to go to the moon. It's not for rockets. It's not any of the things that you might think. It's not to search for alien life. It's to avoid a catastrophic asteroid collision with the Earth. Planetary defense, as it's called. Right now, that is a very legitimate thing to be worrying about. It can, we do track those objects, but the point is, that's got to be Armageddon and Deep Impact, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That has got to be the fact that what's real for people, real inverted commas, what they know about space, what they've seen in brilliant high definition with great CGI, usually, not so much Doctor Who, although latterly much better. But it informs public consciousness. And I think we need to recognize that and take it seriously and realize the consequences of it. So I'm not saying we should have more movies or space. And then we should be aware that people are going to have a very visceral reaction to space because of what they are informed by. I've had conversations with people who, with politicians, with senior civil servants, who you can just tell they want to please come invest in space because it's super cool. And there may be just a touch of what's the right way, appropriate innocence to that. Now I love it. I mean, what's not to like if you're running a space agency, if one wants someone to invest. But there's just so many people say, "Oh, could we just leave it alone?" That has got to be a money sink. That is just you see, because people have got a frame of reference that space is typically one thing for them, often sort of sci-fi enabled, or they'll have seen, they've been inspired by Tim Peake's Flight, or Helen Sharman's, or they just have like the idea of building a rocket. They'll have that thing. And it is often human spaceflight and rockets that really excite
they get
people.
anchored on the particular.
And it's complex, a complex web. That's, I think, the most, the thing that I've seen more than anything else from my time at the space agency is just how interconnected the university system is, the commercial system is. The people who build telecom satellites, they're not hermetically sealed from people who are building the spacecraft on their way to the outer solar system, because they're often do the same thing over Korea, and they have shared hopes and dreams. So we have to understand that web clearly, and we have to understand where the public and where politicians have really come from, and not scoff at it just because we happen to know a little bit more about space. I mean, let's face it, if the experts don't know a bit more, then they're not really experts.
It doesn't really work. No. I like that. So play to the strengths of the frame of reference of the public. You talked there about the cosmic web and the interconnectedness, and one of the big themes of this next 20 series, has been that we have now 21st century technologies and public challenges, but we mainly have 20th century government institutions. And I'm thinking about how space intersects with many, many government departments, but at the same time, you talked about the frontier technologies and innovations which are happening. And I was wondering about your reflections on whether there are material structural tensions between new advances being developed and quite old legacy systems of bureaucracy, and how on a narrow basis, let's say, how do you get Earth observation data usefully into healthcare or into the Environment Agency or other areas? Did you feel those tensions?
Yes, I mean, I absolutely think we need a bit of bureaucracy in society. Effective bureaucracy, right?
Yeah.
I'm glad that we've got institutions. Anchor institutions deeply matter. But the tension's so real. So we were talking earlier about how many satellites are being launched. The received wisdom now is you don't want to leave satellites orbiting forever. That is a very sensible thing, right? You don't want anything to start crashing into each other, or they can fragment when their propulsion tanks go, or whatever set of reasons. Really dangerous, actually. We know that we have the potential, because we see it, we do get satellite collisions from time to time, to have a lot of orbital debris. And people talk about the chain reaction. It's called the Kessler syndrome, where one satellite fragments or hits another, and then before you know it, more and more. A bit like the film Gravity is based on this, to go back to sci-fi. But it can be real. So because of that, the standard way at the end of a satellite's life, which is typically about 5 years, if that, usable satellite time before it runs out of fuel, or frankly the technology is developed so it's not very useful anymore, is for it to deorbit. So to take it into the upper atmosphere is called end of life, and it burns up in the upper atmosphere. Most of the smaller ones, bigger ones do come to some bits survive. That's seen as better. Okay, but let's just play the thought experiment here. What do we know? We know that we're going to have 60,000 plus satellites in orbit by 2030. We know that each 750 kilogram satellite has the same impact on ozone depletion as 250,000 cars annually. That was the statistic that came out of the Interagency Debris Coordination meeting last week or the week before. So that's good data.
Yeah,
good data. As from the research side, that doesn't mean that we are definitely going to have a new hole in the ozone. It does mean that there's a very serious risk that we should be aware of. So that raises a question, doesn't it? Both in terms of how we manage orbital debris to keep the orbit safe, and how we manage orbital debris to make sure to keep the planet safe and all the human beings and life on it safe. But to your point about have we got the right institutions, globally and in the UK, how do you solve that problem? The economic incentives right now are to get the satellites up as soon as you can, and get into exciting things like spectrum filings. But that drives the need to kind of get the satellites up first, to occupy before somebody else occupies. And at just a really basic level, the space and the space agency sit within the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology. But clearly climate, whether that's ozone or carbon, is DESNIS, Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. And that's before we get into all the sort of challenges around defence, national security. So we have got a speed of relevance, which is definitely not being matched in that particular challenge by the way in which the global systems are operating. And it's fundamentally a concern. And I think the UK on this actually has an opportunity to really play its part, because we're good at standard setting and we've got good heritage in the UK on space sustainability and regulation. But it does bring to the front, how are we going to combat that fast enough, particularly when we want short-term economic growth, right? It's not an easy message to say we're really in favour of growth, but we really want people to think a lot more carefully about how they put satellites into space, right? So this stuff is hard.
So that brings us maybe to the broader public services section we wanted to reflect on. And in this next 20 series, we're keen to understand, for that future prosperity over 2 decades, what needs to happen in the next 20 months? Are there some urgent actions to address those novel risks that aren't currently being addressed? What would you like to see change?
Well, I really would like to see the doubling down on that research. I'm really, it gets called atmospheric ablation. That's the language of burning a satellite up in them. And that's being led a lot in the UK, and it was sponsored by and funded by Space Agency. I think we need to take note of what's coming out of that. That's one of the things that I think is most relevant. And 20 months in the scheme of things, is time because we need to operate on, because we're thousands of satellites a year going up.
The exponential curve.
The exponential curve. So I really would like to see that. I'm absolutely fascinated to see, perhaps a little bit more now from the outside, how the one government approach to space, which this government has developed, will play out in practice. Is absolutely the right thing to do. Space cuts across the boundaries of government departments. We've touched on that, and every country has a boundary of space, so it's a global issue. But I really want to see how that plays out well. So I'm really keen for that to move quickly. So we're looking, the sort of space publication will be coming out sooner rather than later. That's going to be a really important document.
And that OneGov approach has the potential to also direct space capabilities or benefits towards specific areas of public services as well. So that could be healthcare, education. Are there kind of really exciting areas of near-term benefit that you see coming down the track within public services?
So some really near-term, and some a little bit further off, but potentially transformational. So near term, there's so much up there already that we can use brilliantly. I remember being challenged, if you only had your last £1 million of budget for the agency, would you spend it on another satellite, or would you spend it on improving the services from satellites that are already operational? And that's a really short answer. Go the latter every single time, because you want to exploit what we've got up there, not just for sustainability reasons, because that's how it takes time to build a new satellite. Let's also use the data that we're already getting down. So now there's all sorts of good pilots going on. There's a terrific program called the Unlocking Space program within the Space Agency, which has a theme for unlocking space for government and for business and for health now. And that's all about taking what's already available and more effectively using it. But starting from the point of view of the customer, the user, not starting from the point of view of what would be cool technology. So, just as we get through into kind of higher and higher bandwidth from space, what that opens up in our ability to monitor, our ability to communicate, for health services, for example. We had a lovely piece of work that we did recently, just making sure that remote communities were connected and including, sort of the health services there. The blue-green algae, across Windermere, Loch Ness, bringing together space data and often terrestrial data either from sensors. And interesting, on the Windermere example, people's use of mobile phones in the areas was really helpful in establishing why we were getting the algae plumes we were going to. I'll talk more about that another time. But the point is, there are just thousands of use cases for how public services can be improved, from water quality to healthcare, that it's just available now. The technology and the data is there. Bit further out, I would love to see a next generation of pharmaceuticals manufactured in space. And that's partly because I spent my whole life doing healthcare and space, right? It's just a nice intersection. But you have companies like BioOrbit who are using the microgravity and vacuum environment of space to create current crystal and structure and protein structures that are so much more pure that instead of having to go to hospital to get your cancer therapy in a really quite complex regime, the same drug can become injectable subcutaneously under the skin almost at home. And what a breakthrough that would be. Wow. Companies that are making Space Forge, that are making diamond substrates and other kind of compound semiconductor substrates, like in space, of such purity that then when they're then grown at scale on Earth, the energy dissipation of those sort of fundamental building blocks of the silicon chip are so much better that you don't get the huge sort of heat losses, which is actually the main cost and carbon issue for radio masts, right? Just as one example. So that's not a healthcare example. That's a kind of a compounds example. We can change the whole way in which we deliver services, cheaper, more efficiently, because for all that it's very complex to get things into space and get them back down. The beautiful thing, I think, isn't just how the wonderful pictures that you see. When you're in space, in microgravity, which is just a nice way of saying zero gravity, really, you've turned off the thing that stopped all other signals from really being seen. When you mix something in like a petri dish or a flask, right, the first thing you notice is it falls, right? Gravity just plays its role before you even know it. And it's like you've been drowned out by sound or light. You've had powerful light shining in your eyes, and it stopped you listening to the signal or seeing the thing that was really there. And with microgravity, you switch it off. You switch off that gravitational impact, and extraordinary things happen that we just couldn't know about on Earth. We could postulate, and we can build things we couldn't imagine, whether that's a scaffold for a childhood tumor, which is another thing that we're looking at in space, or it's new drugs or new formulations of drugs, or it's semiconductors. That is real now. That's not sci-fi. That's not Project Hail Mary, right? There are real ways to build these things, real spacecraft that are developing these things. The platform, the International Space Station, the commercial space stations that are being built are going to be these labs in space to do things we can't dream of.
The purity of space. That was beautifully put, captivating. Thank you. Well, I'm conscious that we're nearly at time, so I want to end with some, I guess, big picture reflections on public services in your career today. So you mentioned, working a lot in healthcare and space, but you've also worked across very different domains of, I guess, government advice, the most senior government advisory, regulation within healthcare, public services, but from a private sector vantage point, working deeply within public services as well as healthcare. And I suppose one immediate question is, why do public services matter to you, and has your answer to that changed from your different experiences?
Well, I don't live in a cave, right? No, I don't suppose many people listen to this, do either. We're in a society, and our society is a liberal democracy, and it's a sort of broadly free market-ish system. So companies deeply matter, and entrepreneurship matters, and so does the public services, right? We all pretty much rely on the NHS, right? If something goes wrong, we turn to the police. If we have a safety net on welfare, if we've done something wrong, we expect the judiciary to have impartiality. These are public services. They should be great. We pay a fair amount of money as a country for these things, and I know that there's a trust that comes from that. People often talk about in the aftermath of the Second World War, this ability to build a welfare state and to create the NHS is, I guess, is the totem of it, but wasn't the only one of by any means. That stands for something. We talk about psychological safety. It's like society-wide psychological safety. Is about knowing that there is an A&E and a general practice for you when you need it. And it's when it's not there in the way that you expected it to be, or that now doesn't fit with your life, or that you can access but in a really clunky way. When the rest of the world has moved on, then I think the trust starts to break down. And for some of these are deeply intergenerational. Like most people will engage in most of their healthcare when they are older.
Yes.
Right? When they're no longer putting money into the system, but they typically have done for many, many years. So the intergenerational thing is you have to believe, I guess, that it's going to be there when you're older. Otherwise, you're paying for someone else and not yourself. And I think that makes it even more important. I'm telling that. And it's also unbelievably interesting.
Yeah.
These are difficult, thorny problems. There's to every problem, every complex problem, there is a solution that is simple, elegant, and wrong. This stuff is difficult, and that's great, because that means that we can work on it and have some hope and some ambition. And none of that is somehow the public services are exciting and private sector is somehow lesser because it's the mandate. Nonsense. There's so much excitement to be derived, but the moral purpose, the societal purpose of having good public services binds us together. And quite frankly, I would quite like them to be there when I need them, and they are.
The many listeners were very excited to hear that you were coming on, and I know there were a few questions were asked, which were kind of reflections on your career to date in terms of lessons that you'd learned. Of course, our journey nearly 20 years ago when we first met would have been at the PSC's Early Reincarnation 2020 delivery, and I was very curious. What things did you believe then, I suppose, from the problem-solving toolkit that maybe you don't believe or believe as much before? I was struck by, consultants strongly believe in the mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive view of the world, where the world can or problems can be broken down into boxes. And a couple of years ago we were talking, I think you certainly offered a much more nuanced and sophisticated view of that to me. But I guess what things what shibboleths did you hold true in terms of problem solving 5, 10, 15 years ago that are different now?
Tremendous use of shibboleth.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate it.
I think I probably was worshipping quite strongly at the altar of the issue tree, which for those people who sort of haven't had that
Pleasure.
experience is the idea, as you say, that you can disaggregate a governing question into its mutually exclusive and collectively exhausting so-called MECE points. And that is the way to structure a problem, and then you can build it back up with a set of solutions at each of those elements. And I was a big fan. I think I may have taken that a little bit too far into my my home life alongside my professional life. What I think I learned, at the risk of the soundbite, is that life is messy rather than MECE.
So good.
Yeah. But I haven't been de-chipped. I still fundamentally believe that it's a good lens into the solution. It's just not the only thing you should apply. So I really like the idea of trying to structure a problem well. The other half of that, the sister tree to the issue tree, is the hypothesis tree. And I think when I started, I was a big fan of the issue tree and a bit more skeptical about the hypothesis tree, the way that you could
I remember that well.
Yeah. And I think I've come to love the hypothesis tree. It's like this weird kind of forest of problem solving techniques. But the idea that you start from a hypothesis and you build it up, and you do that early. You don't wait till you really feel that you know the answer, but you give yourself something to shoot at that is your best informed view at any stage. I really like that. And I also think it really gets you away from the tyranny of believing everything is MECE, because the solution doesn't have to be. But I think if I was really kind of being open or honest with myself and with you, because you asked a question, there is more to life. I can hardly bring myself to say it. There's more to life than an issue tree. What a statement. And joking aside, there's a whole series of sort of qualitative ways to analyze problems, but the cliche is absolutely MECE. You don't get very far in understanding human interaction with an issue tree, and any complex system, in fact any team, any human dynamic, it needs a framework, and you have to be a human being, right? You can't be a tree.
No.
Right? It's a bit more human and a bit less arboreal.
Do you feel like the standing of the art of problem solving has been diminished over recent years? So I say this maybe from an experience that I feel like the job, we're very privileged to do at the PSC. Even a few years ago, it was coming up with, you start with the problem, then you work it through, and there was a lot of appetite and engagement from that. And it strikes me that the discourse in all walks of life is much more solution oriented, partly because rise of technology is maybe is a dominant way of thinking about life. But it's just something I feel, and I was wondering if you share that or not.
I really do. So I thought that I've worked with many brilliant civil servants, and all of the best ones are not just kind and respectful and funny often, but they're rigorous as hell, right? So Jeremy Hayward, as the kind of the epitome of this, so the cabinet secretary, and he died a few years ago. Unbelievably rigorous, right? He absolutely, he would, in a generally kind way, but fast way, just get to the nub of the problem. And he asked perceptive questions, but he also, he valued not just evidence, although he did, but the way in which it was constructed and held together. What was the scaffold? What was the framework that people were using? He was a great example of a great civil servant, in my view. And conversely, I think there is a feeling, and I think it has come up more. I've been in and out of the civil service for 20 odd years now. And I think there is more of a desire to show the process and consultation. And I like process and I like consultation, but they're not enough. They're necessary, but not sufficient conditions. And I've certainly had conversations where why do you believe this answer? I might say something on those lines. And the response is because we held workshops, because we went through the process of gathering information. And that's good, but it is not enough.
Yeah.
That you have to parse that information. You have to put it through some sort of mental hopper, some sort of analysis, and the majority view may be the right view, but wisdom of crowds is valuable, but it's not the totality. And I think it has become less valued than it was. And I think that is at our cost and our peril as in the way that we want to advance things, because in the long term, the right answers bear fruit.
Good. Well, those of us, many of us, hopefully listening who prize it, have a responsibility, I think, to keep that candle burning. Finally, I want to end on a high. But people would probably say public services are at a challenged point, or certainly since the post-war settlement of public services, and we want to look ahead with optimism and ambition for what the world will look like in 2046. So what do you think? If you gaze into the crystal ball, what would good look like in 20 years' time for the next 20?
For the public services?
For public services in the UK. Well, in the UK in particular, but
yeah. At a high level, it's that they work for people in their lives and for all people, because they're public. So they can't just fit into what the archetypes of to take healthcare, the compliant patient wants. I'm going to give an example, and it's not one we need to wait to 2046 about, but wouldn't it be brilliant if we got there long before 2046? If some of the highest uses of healthcare services, particularly primary care services, they live chaotic lives, difficult lives. They experience great pain and great trauma. They may have addictions, they may have serious challenges with their mental health and their physical health. They're typically not characterized by having one thing wrong with them. And for the avoidance of doubt, they are people who have stuff wrong with them. They're not conditions walking around. Right. The idea that they are going to be able to call at 8 or 8:30 in the morning and get a GP appointment, or their mental health crisis is going to occur when the crisis team or the community mental health team are around, it's for the birds. It's just wrong-headed. And so we need to work out ways, and I think there will often be digital ways where we can support people in their time of need in the way that works for them. And I think that's going to be increasingly true for education, as we find that kids and adults, but their learning styles will vary hugely, and we can embrace that and take a load of teachers that would otherwise be, I think, difficult jobs. The education in healthcare and well beyond, we can personalize, because we have these unbelievably powerful technologies, remote technologies like our mobile phones, the stuff that we all now use, the information passing, the large language models, these convergent technologies that are going to allow us to deliver, probably way cheaper, but at least as importantly, much more high quality care, in terms of that it fits for people, and that it recognizes that people are different. They're just different. My needs are just not the same, I suspect, as yours, or pick anyone else, and we've got to get our heads around that. And my parting shot, if there's one thing I used to hate seeing on a slide, was any strategy. It was at the bottom of the slide in this sort of long rectangle. It would have enablers.
Oh my goodness!
And then under enablers, we have workforce and technology. You've got to be kidding! Like the two most important things that you've got: your people and the disruptive technologies. Why don't we flip it around the other side? Like, have the whole the slide, the pack, the document start from the perspective of what could we do with people doing brilliant things, and the technology that we've now got driving the operating model, the process, the strategy, then we would keep transforming for the better.
Paul, what a brilliant place to end a mesmerising conversation. Thank you. I've enjoyed this enormously, and thank you for your invaluable guidance in my career. I really, really appreciate it. But thank you also for listening. This has been the Next 20 from the PSC in Conversation, and we hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. We'll be in touch with a new episode very soon. Cheers.
Thank you.